Welcome to Dowdell Research YouTube channel. Discussion about the 1619 Project in the New York Times Magazine. The 1619 Project logo kept appearing in my news feed on my Facebook posting. And I was wondering, why was the New York Times doing an article about the 1619? I was thinking maybe they were doing something about slavery again, and that they were suggesting that the African American community should just get over slavery. So I had to dig a little bit deeper to find out that it was saying that it was commemorating the 400 years since the first Africans appeared in the Virginia colony. So the project was basically wanting to set the history back as to Africans appearing in the Americas. Instead of 1776, the beginning of the United States of America, they wanted to push it all the way back to 1619. Well, I had problems with that. So this is why I decided to have this discussion. So there were two things that were being set out as the mission of this 1619 project. One was trying to reset the date from 1776 back to 1619. Then the second one would, because they were setting it back to 1619 and the first Africans landing in Virginia colony, they also wanted the lingering effect that it had on those who came as indentured servants while back during that time period. The problem that I had was the Virginia colony was started by England in 1607. It was a company that had investors who were investing in land in the Americas. And the scheme was that they were having individuals come over here, work the land, made the promise that if they were productive, after a certain number of years, they would no longer be indebted to these investors, and part of that land would be given to them, either between maybe 50 to 100 acres. By 1622, they were getting into conflicts with the Indians, and there was a war. And by 1624, King James I had taken over the Virginia colony, and he had placed a governor in the colony for him to take care of who received land and who that land belonged to. They began to give out head rights, and these head rights basically were given to individuals who were coming over, paid for the transportation to come over, and that they were entitled to a certain amount of land, and that they worked this land for a number of years for these investors, and then after that point, they would be given 50 to 100 acres of land. There was jealousy that would come behind this, because of course the wealthy ones were the ones who was getting big blocks of land, but it was the non-land owners who was actually working it, so they weren't too keen on the investors purchasing the land, but the poor people being the one who were working it. So the Virginia colony belonged to King James I, and whatever issues that was going on during that time period would involve Great Britain, and our information we would have to get from Great Britain. Whether if they enslaved Africans, Great Britain would have that information. Great Britain would have that documentation. It wasn't until 1776 that our history began to be written. And when I'm talking about our history, I'm talking about the United States of America, and the type of slavery which they practiced was the chattel slavery, a very harsh slavery, which they took the rights away from humanness from African Americans, Africans and African Americans. And that history is brutal enough, and I think we need to stay within that time period to focus, and that would be less than 400 years, 1776 to 1865. That's less than maybe less than 100 years. So if you can stick to that telling of that story, that history of the abuse of African Americans and the reparation that is due to those individuals, because if you look at 1865 to 2019, we're talking about 155 years. So that's a smaller window in which to research the history, which they basically kept the information hidden, because at one time they were saying they couldn't even tell you what part of Africa that folks were coming from, which we find that this is untrue when they clearly have records of saying where certain individuals came from. They talk about they got ship records and so on and so forth. But I just think that the 1619 Project was brought up to talk about race, because it's a political year that's coming up, and you had a governor that was busted for wearing blackface, but he didn't own up to the fact that he was in blackface. And the focus is in the area of Virginia where he's governor at too. So, I'm just a little skeptic of this big omission, and to go back and zone into 1619, the first Africans landing. They're just what is on those 20 individuals when there's millions of African Americans that are in the United States. So no, I'm not buying. I'm thinking it's a political move. I think that's all that I have to say at this particular point in time. I've done a lot of research with my family history. You can go to Dowdale Genealogy on Facebook and find me there. You can drop your comments at the bottom of this broadcast. And if you have any other suggestions for me, I would hope that you would drop them in the link as well. Thank you for listening.